All right. Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology, episode 6. Today, we're going to expand a little bit more. We've been talking about the Bible. Well, first, we talked about it as a narrative. Then we talked about some different perspectives we would be taking on it. And now, this episode, I just wanted to highlight two particular themes that I think run throughout the Bible and are under-discussed, if you will, in Christian circles. One of them, I think, is probably not that controversial. The other one might seem a little controversial to people because it is, I guess, kind of foreign from the way people think. But let's start, I guess, with that one potentially. And that is that throughout the Bible, one of the themes that I see is the maturation of the human species as a whole, of humanity as a whole. And this might seem a little weird, but there are some places at which I see this. So if we were to start, for instance, we go to the Garden of Eden, right? And we see this idea of, humanity in this very innocent state, right? And if you think about it, it's kind of like a child after they're born, right? Very innocent. And they're just doing what they do. However, they reach a point where you can give them a rule, or various rules. And they reach a point where they break that rule. They violate that rule. Usually this occurs, at least has been the experience with my two kids, and I think this is probably the experience most of the case, is the idea of them trying to do something, wanting to do something, being told no, and then they do it anyways, usually watching you the whole time to see what'll happen. But they reach this point where they decide to break the rule. And this is actually a point of maturation, right? It's a sign that they've matured to the point where they're not reacting on instinct in the same way they are just after being born. They're making conscious choices. Now, they made the wrong choice, that's certainly the case. They shouldn't have done that after they said no. But it's kind of the fact that they did the wrong thing is actually an indication to us that they've now matured to the point where they're making their own choices, not just reacting on instinct, which they would be if they continued to follow and never made a mistake, right? When I say, no, don't do that. If they complied every single time, there's a part of you that would actually wonder, have they matured to the point where they can even make the choice to not comply? Or are they just complying off instinct still, right? And it's when they don't comply that it's a point of maturation. So that's one of the things, we'll discuss that even more when we get there. It's one of the things I see in the fall of man, is this like initial point of maturation, which aligns very much with a young child. From there, though, we look at the idea of consequences, right? And there are consequences for making the wrong choice. But very much as you grow up, the consequences for making the wrong choices become larger, right? This is one of the things. As you mature, you grow to the point where you are now fully capable of bearing the full responsibility for your consequences. And one of the ways in which I see this in the Bible is if we look at the consequences for murder, right? If you start with Cain, so we're moving a little bit forward more in the story. If you start with Cain and Abel, Cain murders Abel, but the consequence he bears is not his life being the cost. In fact, his life is protected and he bears a different penalty for it, but it's not the full responsibility. However, when you get to Noah and you get to the flood and you get on the other side of the flood, one of the things God says at the other end of that is, hey, now if man spills man's blood, by man his blood shall be spilled, right? This to me is symbolically here saying you have reached a point as a species here of maturation where you're now capable of bearing the full consequences of the responsibility that you have, right? It's now 1-to-1. You've reached that point of maturation, just as we do, right? We grow up, and for a while our parents, perhaps shield us from the full consequences of our choices and bear some of that upon themselves. And then eventually we grow up and now must face the full consequences of our actions.
Let me jump in there, because I think that what we're seeing too is that there's, in unison with the increase in consequences, or at least the weight of the consequences, is the capability of destructive power as well.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, go back to the maturation of a typical human being. As a child, if you can cause some pretty good destruction as a kid, but there's a limit to what you're capable of doing, just because you don't know how to be effectively destructive.
Sure.
And you also are simply not large enough to be effectively destructive.
It's
a normal-sized human being.
More significant destruction would happen by chance,
Exactly.
than by intent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so then you see this as you grow up, you have the chance to be obviously much more destructive, not only just 1-to-1 physically, but also you can craft things that will be destructive at a very large scale.
We see this specifically in the line of Cain, the seventh generation. The final member we're told about is Lamech, who has kills someone and says, if Cain's was 7 times, mine is 77 times, right?
No. And refresh my memory, if I'm remembering correctly, Cain's becomes the line that invents weaponry.
It invents a bunch of stuff. We'll get to that. We'll leave that. When we get to Cain at some point, there's a lot, but weaponry is one of the things. But actually, there's more than that too. It's also art. It's also agriculture. All of it sort of is actually birthed from the line of Cain. So,
which is interesting.
Yeah.
But in terms of destructive capability, going back to the idea of Noah, is God just had to do a flood, had to flood the entire earth in order to wipe out the destructive power of humanity. And so there's also this realization of how destructive humanity can actually be.
Right. Yeah. And part of your maturation process is coming to that realization of what you're actually capable of.
Yeah.
But then I want to show the maturation thing in one other way here too, which is the idea of first humanity through Israel is given the law, right? Which is a series of rules. And then, as we talked about in the previous episode, you have Jesus who says, I come to fulfill the law. And one of the ways I interpret that is him explaining, look, the laws, that's just part of the whole idea. What matters here is the principles underneath that the laws are born out of. And that relates very much to, as you're growing up as a kid, your parents give you a variety of rules, right? And you follow those rules, and that's what you do. That's what you're supposed to do anyways. But as you get older and older and older, you start to learn, and hopefully your parents teach you the principles behind those rules and the reason those rules exist, and the fact that those rules are born out of an idea, and that idea is what really matters. And as you grow, you need to adapt those ideas to your own code of conduct and become less dependent upon rules and less reliant upon rules and more dependent upon understanding the principles of right behavior and applying those to your life throughout. And that, I think we see that same thing in the transition from the law to Jesus. So that's one thing I see in the Bible. One thing I think we'll discuss throughout here is it's telling the story of human maturation, of humanity's maturation, which is, it's the reason I say this one might be a little more controversial is one of the things that Christianity, I think, rightly does point out, right, is there is a human nature that is consistent across time. And the reason we are invested in pointing that out is the idea we know humanity can't grow past sin, right? No matter what, humanity will sin. that is what we do, in this creation here. We mess up and we sin. And so I don't want to say that by humanity growing and maturing, like we're just going to eventually move past that. Obviously, we can't do that without the sanctification of Christ. But we can grow and move forward in our understanding and our making right choices and all of that. And I think that is what we see the story of in the Bible. And now humanity at this point, we're full grown adults, right? We don't have any more excuses. It's kind of what it means. But that is one perspective we're going to take here as we look through the Bible. One of the themes we'll look at in terms of the past is the idea of, hey, humanity is still figuring this stuff out. They're still growing. They're still maturing. And honestly, that even in a sense to me is why some of those early stories may appear to us to be almost childlike in their behavior, right? I mean, if you read open and honestly and just like assume only the words were said where the words were said in the story of Eve eating the fruit, right, of woman eating the fruit, like it is childlike, like who would be duped by that? Those words aren't fooling you. They wouldn't manipulate an adult that easily, if you were to take it that way. Now when we get to that, there's some different approaches to that section, but that is why these early stories might appear somewhat childlike to us, or somewhat immature in the way they are a story. And I think we see that changes as the Bible goes along, and we get some stories that are more mature in their storytelling approach as well. So
I think it's important to emphasize that in the sense that you're saying we're, quote, a fully grown adult is in the collective sense.
Yes.
We are fully grown adults, which means that you have access to the experiences of all of the people that came before you. And the Bible is conveying all of this maturation process to you. And that is accessible to you, but it is only useful if it is accessed.
Yes.
So in the same
very true.
way, from the time we're infants, we have the capacity to potentially be just as destructive as our ancestors to some degree. One could argue, and I have no idea if there's any sort of research or arguments about this, if that perhaps over the course of the past, however long humans have been around, there's been some sort of selection process to weed out people who are inordinately destructive. But we still do have some of that destructive capability. You only need to look back 60 years, 70 years to see how destructive humans can be.
Sure. I mean, even today, we're still pretty destructive.
Exactly.
It takes different forms and whatnot. But yes, that is important to point out, though. The as you mature, your life experience as an individual gives various opportunities for lessons, right? That you're meant to apply, and by the time you become an adult, have thus grown and matured. And so we have, through the Bible, the lessons that we should be pulling out of the past of humanity
without having to experience them
sometimes. It's here they are. Learn these lessons, learn them so you don't have to experience them, apply them, and live that way.
It's comparable to if you want to go into some, let's say, advanced mathematics. You don't need to reinvent calculus. You can learn calculus, and then you can push the bounds of what we already know.
Right.
And so, for all intents and purposes,
that's the nature of innovation.
Exactly. As reading the scripture is pulling out what are we already know, and then maybe you can experience new things to learn a little bit more.
So each generation, in a sense, should be moving closer and closer. Each generation of Christians should be moving closer and closer to that more and more mature, righteous life.
Exactly.
Assuming we're learning the lessons and teaching them well, which is one of the things I think we probably haven't done a great job of. Although it's one of the things that I now, with my own kids, taking this perspective to the Bible, am trying to, as I teach them, it will be from this perspective a little bit of, hey, humanity as a whole here, we've matured past these points. And so we should learn these lessons and not have to learn them again and not make those same errors.
Yeah.
All right. And so then the other way, another theme throughout the Bible that we want to hit on, and this is, I think this is particularly relevant today, very much in our modern society of like the last few years. This has become a particularly big deal. It's been a slow buildup, but I think it's very evident right now that this is particularly relevant. And that is the idea of identity. Identity is a thing that is very much on people's minds at this moment. And it is out there in the public discussion. And I think that even people who don't think it's important or don't would reject, I guess, the way it's being handled in the public discussion, I think they don't realize actually just how important it is and how much it is exposing something about humanity. So what we're seeing right now is a lot of the idea of deriving one's identity from belonging to different groups, right? You're deriving your identity from characteristics, things like race or gender, those kind of things, choices you make. That is right now where people are trying to derive their identity from. Mm-hmm. And I think part of the reason we're seeing so much turmoil around these issues is because they're ultimately finding that unsatisfactory. But the fact that people are looking externally to derive their identity is, I think, pretty important. And this is something someone like myself who very much rejects the idea of looking to a group for your identity. This was sort of a weird realization for me to come to. I'm very much of the nature that everyone has their own individual identity. Why are we even bothering with group elements, right? Why does that matter? Mm-hmm. But I've come to realize, I think that's one of the things that exists within humanity, within humans, that actually pulls us towards God, and actually is one of the things that is that a part of that God-shaped hole, if you will. And I see that being shown in the Bible, because I see all three, and I think there are three main ways we can derive our identity, described in the Bible and emphasized in the Bible. And it's in different parts of the Bible. So the first being Genesis. If you read Genesis, one of the main themes going on there is family, right? And this is one of the places for sure that people derive their identity from, is the family they belong to, right? The way those people have influenced them, shaped them. They derive a lot from that. It's why we carry on last names, right? And identify ourselves still as parts of these families. It's one of the things people change, and it's one of the things people change, not just when they get married, but they'll change when they are upset, I guess, with their family. It's one of the things they'll do.
And still some modern cultures and a lot of ancient cultures, the last name was primary. That was the first thing that you were known as, and there's still Asian cultures where that's your first name is your familial name.
Yes. Caesar, Julius Caesar.
Exactly.
It was that at that time.
Yeah.
And so family is really one of the things we see throughout Genesis. And in the transition from Genesis to Exodus, and really the rest of the Old Testament, is the idea of national identity, although I think we can look at that more loosely as being a community identity. And so this is identity that comes from belonging to a group, right? So you have family identity, which is a group you're kind of just born into, right? So that could even be, you could think of that in terms of innate characteristics, right? Like your race or whatnot. You're born into that level of identity. And then the rest of the Old Testament covers identity of choice in a sense. Now we understand Israel, you're born into it. But I
This
mean,
is
you could
the
also,
Israelites asking for a king.
yes,
That's what
yes,
this
yeah.
is this
Mm-hmm.
is this is the moment at which the Israelites say, we have a God and we have somebody who's leading us, but more significantly, we want a present and physical symbol that's going to represent who we are.
Yeah.
This is the Israelites
Yes.
trying to construct or creating the idol, of the golden lamb, and looking at that and saying, this is some sort of physical representation of us as an identity, the symbolic power of that.
Right, right. And really being a part of the nation of Israel is a product of choice, right? Of
Exactly.
choosing to live by the law, right?
Exactly.
And choosing to uphold that. And so that's why when for periods of time the law is not followed, the nation falls apart, right? And crumbles. So this is the idea of identity being derived from choice.
Yeah.
And then it's in Jesus, actually, that we see the third level of identity, which is the one that I more am concerned with traditionally, which is the individual, right? Because in Jesus, we see the idea of individual salvation, right? It's not related to a group. So it's the individual identity. But in Jesus, Jesus is actually the uniter of all three of these levels, because Jesus, well, Jesus is king, right, of a nation. He is king. He is the individual, right? The individual, the perfect Adam. That there we see sort of the individual symbolized. He also is family, right? Because he describes us, the church is his bride, right? Which is family. And he talks about brothers and sisters in him. And even, we see that family sense throughout the church, right? Especially the early church too, the idea of referring to each other as brothers and sisters in Christ and all of that. So he brings all three ideas together, yet at the same time asks you to reject all forms of identity outside of himself, right? This is the idea of we must die to ourselves and be reborn in him. So we lose all other forms of familial identity or, born characteristics identity. We lose the chosen community identity. That goes away. Even our individual identity. All that must go away in the name of Christ. And we take our identity in him alone. But in doing that, we find ourselves fulfilled in all three levels of identity, right? The family, the nation, the individual. We find the fulfillment of those identities in him. And we find in him the only way in which all three can coexist. Because one of the things we'll see throughout the Old Testament, I think you can look at world history and we see it too, is that these different kinds of identities come into conflict with each other all the time. And they don't exist cohesively in the world.
Yeah.
But in Jesus, you find the three existing cohesively. And that's the only place you find it existing cohesively. So that is one of the themes I want to hit here, is identity in the Bible.
Let me step back just really quick to where you began this with talking about how you look, for some reason, naturally, you tend to look at people seeking out some form of identity, either in race or ethnicity or in whatever type of group you're a part of, selected identities, all sorts of things like that. I think this is, again, we talked about this in the previous episode, but the effects of growing up in the church and growing up in a Jesus-centered church and never understanding life outside of Christ-centered church life, because and even more than that, Protestant centered church life, because Martin Luther is the one who comes along and says the priesthood of all believers, that solo scriptura, the idea that you are the one who goes and approaches God. You don't have to go through a conduit like the Catholic Church, because I think Catholicism still holds on to a lot of this identity, and I think it's one of the reasons it's so potent is because identifying as a Catholic is so significant to people. It is a group. It's with the symbolic person of the Pope being that same representation that you see in like the king with Israel.
There's even shades of it in Protestantism too, because we have denominations, and for some people that becomes a very big deal, and I don't like it at all. But even there, we see shades of trying to draw identity in other ways.
Correct. I think in the same way that you could say that within the confines of Catholicism, you can still find, because the Bible is still there and Christ is there, you can find this still there, like somebody who's in the Catholic Church could come to this truth. You could find that in Protestantism too. I think Protestantism also though can get just as off as Catholicism in this regards. But yeah, I think that's one of the effects though of growing up though in the Protestant church and maybe in the particular places.
You're definitely more prone to the individual.
You look at the individual first. Yeah, you think that's the fundamental, because you're told that you say the prayer to come to Christ, and it can't be said by your parents. It can't be done by anybody else. It has to be you yourself who goes up and does that. And so yeah, I think there's a significant influence on that. So
and it does even a little bit tie in with the maturation idea too, right? When you're a kid, you tend to identify very much with your family, and then you start to recognize community, and then the idea of the Bible in this maturation point is humanity has matured to the point where the individuals are now able to bear the full responsibility and make that choice to follow Christ of themselves, right? And there's of course echoes of that with, going to the temple to offer sacrifices and those kind of things building up to Jesus. But it's in Jesus that we see sort of that full maturation of identity, to pair these two ideas together. So those are a couple of themes I want to hit as we go through this. And if you have any questions on that or thoughts, or you want to just tell us we're idiots, feel free to reach out to us.
Always enjoy that.
unschooltheology@protonmail.com, and like, subscribe, and do all those things as well. So see you next time.